Why investigate moral psychology? Well, actually, the first thing I want to do here is not to tell you what I think, but rather to turn the question over to you. And to that end, what I'd like you to do is zip onto the Teams channel for moral psychology, go to the channel that says live whole class meetings. By the time you see this, the title may have changed to add the date and time there of the meetings. And just reply to the message that I put there asking for a question. Ideally, what I'd like you to do, if you're watching this with your lecture buddy, you know that I'm suggesting you should always be watching these lectures with somebody else, perhaps via WhatsApp or some other channel, so that you can talk about, the lectures and other things. Just ask the question, why are you doing moral psychology? What's brought you here? Now, I think that's going to be interesting for two reasons. One is that I'm just curious why you're interested, and that might guide me in thinking about how the course unfolds. The other thing is that it might be interesting for you to look at the range of interests that other people on the course have. Now, normally at this point I would say, let's take 90 seconds here, but I have no idea how long it will take you to go through the teams and have a think and so on. So I'm not going to do that for now. But please do, before we go any further, just stop and offer me a single sentence, or more if you like. Why are you taking the course Moral Psychology? Or if you're not taking it, why are you thinking about it? Why are you here? What's in it for you, potentially? All right, good. So I'm going to assume that you've done that. And I want to suggest to you that there are 3 good reasons and 1 terrible reason for thinking about moral psychology. The first reason concerns human sociality. You see, moral psychology is foundational for the way that humans live. The curious thing about humans is that they live in societies which are roughly as complex as the societies of social insects like ants or bees. But humans, remarkably, cooperate with non-kin. Indeed, just by taking this course at the university, you and I are cooperated, although we don't have any kin relation, or at least we don't know of any kin relation between us. So this is an example of cooperation with non-kin, and it's highly pervasive in human societies. So that's surprising. How is that possible? Well, one of the clues is this, that for humans this has begun relatively recently. It's only relatively recently that humans live in societies with anything approaching the complexity of some social insect societies. And that's far too short a time for evolution to do much of the explanation. In this sense, it can't be that the capacity to live in these super complicated societies is to be explained by some special evolutionary adaptations for that. And that in particular wouldn't make a lot of sense in terms of the non-kin as well. So we're faced with a really interesting puzzle. How is this possible? And if we have a look at the anthropologists Richardson and Boyd, they offer us an interesting suggestion, which as you can find made by several different researchers in this area. They suggest that humans are adopted to live in morally structured communities thanks in part to the capacity to operate systems of moralistic punishment and susceptibility to moral suasion. Now you can see how this might work out if we turn to another group of anthropologists and social psychologists, Haidt, Joseph and Graham, who offer us the view that humans' ethical abilities rest on what they call intuitive ethics. Intuitive ethics in 4 or perhaps 5 domains. So there are capacities to recognise and respond to cases where somebody is harmed or where there is care. Also, there is concern and emotional reactions to fairness and tendencies to behave in ways which manifest reciprocity. I give you something, you then give me something. There's something reciprocal in that arrangement. Humans and other animals also appear to demonstrate in-group loyalty, so loyalty to members of a perceived in-group over members of a perceived out-group, and they show respect for authority. Now, Haidt, Joseph and Graham claim that these first 4 are present in many animals, not just humans, but plenty of non-human animals as well. I put purity or sanctity as the outlier here, because although that does seem to be an important driver of human ethical abilities, it's not something that you find in lots of animals other than humans, and that may be because this is actually linked to the relatively recent transition that humans have made to largely meat-based diets, where they don't have the sort of immune systems that animals like vultures have, and so they're much more susceptible to parasites when they're eating meat than animals that have been eating meat for a much longer time, like vultures are. So it might be that purity and sanctity is really there essentially to stop you doing what vultures do and eating in the way that they do, and you wouldn't necessarily find that in lots of other animals. So look, I'm going to put that aside anyway, because that complicates the picture here. What I want to suggest is this: if you think that there are these 5 basic intuitive foundations, you can kind of see how it might be that your ethical abilities enable cooperation in large, complicated societies. So what Hyde, Joseph and Graham are suggesting is roughly this. We'll consider this idea in more detail later. They're suggesting, first of all, that humans have, and many other animals, have basic capacities to respond in certain ways when they see violations of fairness or of in-group loyalty and so on, and that they have ways of acting which support these things. Secondly, these authors are claiming that the 4 abilities have a long evolutionary history. Thirdly, they're claiming that humans' ethical abilities are not captured by these 4 basic abilities, but rather that these 4 basic abilities provide the basis for a process of cultural evolution, which results in, among different human cultures, different ethical abilities, ethical capacities, values, principles, and the rest. So our interest for now is this thought, that if we take these as basic intuitive capacities, we can see why it might be that ethical abilities are so important for human societies. Actually, you can get there though without buying into that picture about intuitive ethics, or as we'll later call it, moral foundations. Hamlin, for example, isn't committed theoretically to that picture, but on the basis of some developmental research, she draws the conclusion that humans, both individually and as a species, develop morality because it's required for cooperative systems to flourish. So there are a variety of ways to reach the conclusion that your ethical abilities are essential for human cooperation, and the possibility of living in complicated societies made up of non-kin relations. That's one reason for thinking that moral psychology ought to be interesting and important in its own right. That for me motivates thinking, okay, let's find out about the psychological basis of these ethical abilities. But it's not just that draws me to this topic. Another thought is that by studying moral psychology, I might come to learn something about the nature of political conflict. I might try to understand something about why certain conflicts arise, maybe why some are absolutely intractable, and what might be done in other cases to resolve those conflicts. And in particular, what we'll do in this course is to focus on the best research case where we've got ethical abilities, cultural differences, and political conflict, the case of climate change. But you'll see that there's a question mark here at the end, because I'm not going to tell you on this course that the research on moral psychology really does illuminate political conflict over climate change. One of our questions will be whether it does or not. And my role on this course as your lecturer is to introduce you to the sources and the debates. Your job as the philosopher in the room is to discover the truth about this, whether we really can shed light on political conflict by appeal to moral psychology. So debate on this topic starts with an observation, and the observation is that liberals are generally more concerned about climate change than conservatives. But it's not obvious why that should be true. It could just as easily have gone the other way round. After all, you might think, holding on to what makes America great, for example, involves preserving the environmental conditions which allow Americans to thrive and exercise their dominance over the world's peoples and resources. Or you might think that, holding on to the climate, preventing things like global warming, is a matter of keeping our environment pure, the way that, perhaps God intended it to be. So it's very easy, I think, to see, if you think about it, climate change as a fundamentally conservative issue, one which liberals are far less interested in because they're more interested in issues about fairness or social justice and the rest. Now, of course, all these things are bound up together. The thought here is just that we have a good question here. Why is it that liberals are more concerned about climate change than conservatives? Why should that be an issue that divides people on different ends of a political spectrum rather than unites them? 90 seconds with your lecture buddy. Just have a guess. What do you think might be behind this political divide over climate change? Speculate on the answer to this question. Go. So let's look at the leading, although I think quite questionable, attempt to answer this question. This is the idea that liberals and conservatives differ in the ethical principles they find most compelling, together with the observation that issues about climate change tend to be framed in terms of fairness rather than in terms of issues like purity, thus making them more appealing to conservatives than liberals. Why might somebody think that? Well, here's some results from an experiment that Feinberg and Willer did back in 2013. What they did was very simple. They gave participants a questionnaire which allowed them to identify themselves as more liberal or more conservative, divided their participants into two. Then their participants got either a control question, and the control question, they were just given a story about someone's life, and they were asked to rank on a scale, I think it was from 0 to 6, how ethical they thought this person was. And what you can see in the control condition, liberals and conservatives, not significantly different. But then there was a variation here. So this person in the non-recycle condition, during the course of the day, has some lunch and throws the lunch packaging into the bin to be made into landfill. And what you can see here is that the liberals regard that person as significantly less ethical than the control condition, whereas the conservatives, there's actually no significant difference here at all. Likewise, in the story where this person takes the lunch package and carefully recycles it, you see that the liberals think that's pretty different from an ethical point of view. Not recycling makes you bad. Whereas the conservatives just don't see it that way. So the conservatives essentially think It's pretty much the same whether you recycle or not. Apparently they're not seeing this as an ethical issue. So what Feinberg and Willer's results are supposed to illustrate, not demonstrate, but illustrate, is that in many cases liberals see environmental issues as ethical issues, whereas conservatives tend not to. Now, you can't actually get that from the graph. If you read the paper carefully, you realise that the conclusion they're drawing is on the basis of a regression analysis, very simple regression analysis, but the graph provides a nice illustration of the idea. So the idea, once again, is that liberals are prone to see environmental issues like recycling as ethical issues, whereas conservatives are not. We also know that when people see something as an ethical issue, they tend to give it much more priority in their actions and their judgments than when they don't see it as an ethical issue. So that potentially might explain why liberals, rather than conservatives, are more concerned about climate change. But it raises a further question. And the question is this: why is it that liberals are more likely than conservatives to regard climate change as an ethical issue? Why should that be? It's far from obvious why there should be a political divide over the ethics of climate change. I mean, you know, if you're a liberal living by the sea, you're no more or less susceptible to your house being washed away than the conservative neighbour that you have, right? So why is it so different? Here's a theory. This, again, I think is the leading theory. The theory notices that issues about climate change are generally framed in terms of harm, care and fairness, rather than in terms of in-group loyalty and respect for authority, purity or sanctity. Although they could be framed in that way, and you'll see later that attempts to frame climate change issues in that way have quite striking effects on conservatives. What we also know, or guess from the research by Hyde, Joseph and Graham, is that there's a very big cultural difference in the kind of ethical principles that people have. The big cultural difference doesn't concern two communities that live very far apart away, though, different ends of the earth. The largest observed cultural difference that's relevant to moral psychology is actually one for communities which live together, communities which you probably move between on a daily basis. Liberals versus conservatives. Liberals are, so Hyde, Joseph and Graham will examine this critically, liberals are supposed to prioritise harm and fairness in their ethical thinking and downplay factors like in-group loyalty, respect for authority, purity or sanctity. So think about political debates over sexuality, for example, gay marriage. In those debates, conservatives will often appeal to things like purity or sanctity. Liberals, on the other side, just seem entirely baffled by those kind of considerations sometimes. So this has some kind of, on the face of it, plausibility. The idea that liberals tend to promote just two factors in their ethical thinking, whereas conservatives are maybe more interested in all of the factors. And that would then, says Markowitz and Sharif, explain why the fact that environmental issues are framed in terms of harm and fairness predominantly, explain why conservatives feel much less motivated to act on them. Here's how they put the idea. The moral framing of climate change has typically focused on only the first two values, harm to the present and future generations, and unfairness of the distribution of burdens caused by climate change. As a result, justification for action on climate change holds less moral priority for conservatives than liberals. Now, I'm not saying this is the truth. One of our jobs is to find out what the evidence for this statement is and how convincing it is. But what I am saying is that if it were true, we would have a nice explanation of the difference. An interesting explanation because it has actionable consequences. Reframe the debate in terms which appeal to conservatives as well as liberals, and you can get more action on climate change, if this is right. So it seems to me that research on moral psychology could be interesting because it can inform our understanding of political conflicts and perhaps even guide some practical interventions. But there's a third reason why I think that we should be interested in moral psychology, or at least why I'm interested in moral psychology. It doesn't really matter whether it moves you or not because there's quite a lot going on this course already. I want to know whether discoveries about moral psychology might inform the ethical principles that we accept. But once again here, you note there's a question mark here. That question mark is super important. I described the course as Moral Psychology, the science of good and evil, question mark. One of our questions is whether discoveries in moral psychology really do motivate changes in ethical thinking. Is that an appropriate thing to happen or not? And once again, my job in this course is to point you in the direction of the debates. Your job as the philosophers in the room is to provide me with some guide to the truth. So you've got the hard thing. You've got the hard job, in other words. What I'm going to do is just introduce you to some claims which moral psychologists have made on the basis of their discoveries. I'm not saying that these are true. I'm not saying they're false. That's to be investigated. Sidney Armstrong and colleagues say humans lack direct insight into moral properties. Now that's interesting because there is a branch of ethical thinking which depends precisely on the idea that humans do have direct insight into moral properties. So if reflection on moral psychology can show that there's a lack of direct insight, that would already have quite a big impact on ethics as currently practiced by many philosophers. The same authors, Sidney Armstrong and colleagues, also argue that intuitions cannot be used to counterexample theories on the basis, again, of research in moral psychology. Now, this is kind of a dramatic finding because there is a ton of philosophy that says, look, here's your utilitarian or consequentialist or deontological position. Here's the consequence of that position. But it's kind of counterintuitive that this is really correct, and therefore we have to reject your theory. But all of that argument depends on what they call intuitions, what David Lewis calls guesses. An intuition is just a guess. If the guesses that people make are not to be trusted, they're intuitions, then we can't use that mode of argument in defending or knocking down ethical theories. Green argues that intuitions are unreliable in unfamiliar situations, where the asterisk there on unfamiliar is because that's a technical term. An unfamiliar situation is one in which we have inadequate evolutionary, cultural or personal experience. So Green is offering us here, I think, a more refined argument about how we should control the use of intuitions in debates about ethical principles. But Green also offers a very bold claim. He says philosophers, including Kant, do not use reason to figure out what is right or wrong. That's kind of, amazing, right? Amazing. Have you read books on ethics? I don't read a lot of ethics, but a lot of those books seem to be exactly attempts to use reason to figure out what's right or wrong. Green says that's actually not what's happening there. He says that reason is being used primarily to justify and organise their pre-existing intuitive conclusions. If that's right, I think that we have quite a big problem in how to approach discovering truths about ethical principles. Now, of course, it might be that Green, Sidney Armstrong and the rest are not right. That's one of the questions that we face for this course. But if they are right, there might be some quite substantial changes to how we approach ethics as a topic. So I promised you 3 reasons why studying moral psychology could be interesting, but also 1 reason why you shouldn't study moral psychology, or rather something which isn't the reason for studying it. And this is the idea that moral psychology might allow you to make changes in your personal ethical views. It might change your giving, for example, or how you care for other people. What I want to suggest here is very simple. If you think about research in linguistics or psycholinguistics, and you were doing a course on that, I think it's very unlikely that you would change how you communicate with words, how you speak or write, on the basis of discoveries in psycholinguistics. It can happen, but it's something which is relatively rare, and there's good reason for that. Theories on psycholinguistics are really far from the point where they have robust practical applications. Similarly, if you think about discoveries in physics, you wouldn't fly in an aeroplane or use a microwave oven on the basis of discoveries just in physics. You're also relying on a bunch of people who do the engineering, the testing, the certification and so on. And even then, right, even once the engineers have been in and the plane has been tested with non-humans and all the rest of it, you might not want to be the first person to fly on an aeroplane, you might want to wait for a bit of experience to kick in. Now, I want to suggest that things are much the same in the case of moral psychology. Moral psychology is the attempt to understand psychological basis, the states and processes that underpin your ethical abilities. That attempt is in very early stages, and there are not things like the engineers of ethics. There are not people who've tried out implementing ideas from moral psychology and sort of encountered all of the various pitfalls that you get when you first take to the skies in an aeroplane. So the suggestion here is that if you were thinking about moral psychology because you think, gosh, that might change my ethical practices, it's probably not going to work out very well. It's probably not going to work out very well for just the same reasons that relying on physics or psycholinguistics probably isn't going to work out that well. So why should we investigate moral psychology? What I've suggested is that it's intrinsically important because it's one of the foundations for human sociality. And human sociality is interesting because it has this puzzling combination of massive complexity, like that found in social insects, in the absence of kin relationships being the main thing that holds it all together. What could it be that holds it all together? Seems like the ethical ability is going to play a big role there. I think moral psychology might be interesting for understanding political conflict, perhaps even for understanding where political conflict can't be overcome, what kind of interventions might be made in other cases. And I think moral psychology might be interesting because it may change the way that as philosophers we approach arguing about, defending and discovering claims in ethics and claims about ethical principles. But I'm very much looking forward to, in that team chat, going over some of the reasons why you think that this could be an interesting course. Surely there are many further reasons beside to care about moral psychology.